Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm delighted to welcome you and, of course, Professor Rangarajan. Professor Rangarajan was my professor when I came here, 81 to 83. And the joke we had about Professor Rangarajan was that he graduated with us. Professors sometimes don't graduate with students, but Professor Rangarajan was here 1968 to 1983. And so Jayant had him as his professor, as did several of our alumni. And those of us from those years and people in our economics area faculty, all of us will vouchsafe, he's the doyen of Indian economists. He looks younger. And so Professor Rangarajan, till 2014, was chairman of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, a position that he held since January 2005, except for a short period during 2008-2009, when he was Member of Parliament in Rajya Sabha. And prior to that, he was chairman of the 12th Finance Commission. Dr. Rangarajan was governor of the Reserve Bank of India during 1992-1997, and you will note from the years that he was very actively involved in the design and implementation of the reform agenda. Professor Rangarajan's honors degree is from Madras, PhD from University of Pennsylvania, where he has also taught in the Wharton School. He taught as well in the Graduate School of Business Administration at NYU and Loyola College and University of Rajasthan, as well as ISI. And he is currently chairman of Madras School of Economics and chancellor of University of Hyderabad, all of which are fabulous. But the thing that I really want to highlight is he's our professor, 68 to 83. Professor Rangarajan was honored by the Padma Vibhushan in 2002. All these honors and all the wonderful experiences of his academic career pale in comparison to the generosity of his temperament and the straightforwardness with which he has often taught generations of us and has been a beacon to academics on maintaining high quality work and through a gentle voice, making sure that honest truths are heard far and wide. Our pleasure, Professor Rangarajan, to welcome you.
Professor Nanda, distinguished faculty and invitees, and my young friends. It gives me a great pleasure to be back on IIMA campus. I recall with great fondness the years that I spent here, almost a decade and a half. I'm happy to meet some of my old friends here on this occasion. I left in 1982 and went into public policy making from the academia. Of course, in the meantime, since then, this institution has grown stronger, diversified, and commands worldwide respect. I wish the institution all success in future efforts, and I'm sure it will climb to even higher levels of excellence in the coming years. This year marks the completion of 25 years of the launching of the reforms. And that is why I thought I might take this opportunity that has been given to me to talk about the road that we had traveled by, the initial difficulties, concerns, and obstructions. And also to indicate somewhat the road that lies ahead of us in terms of the reforms. This is history in some way, but I think some history is always useful. 1991 is an important landmark in the post-independence economic history of the country. Many of you here may not have been born even at that time. But the country faced an acute economic crisis triggered by a severe balance of payments problem. And the crisis was converted into an opportunity to bring about fundamental changes in India's economic policy. The response to the crisis was to put in place a set of policies aimed at stabilization and structural reform. Stabilization policies were aimed at correcting the excesses that have happened on the balance of payments and the fiscal side, while structural reforms were aimed at removing the rigidities that have entered into the economic system and pushed the economy forward. In the 1950s and 60s, the dominant thought in economic literature was that state had an important role to play and that it should take actions to correct what came to be described as market failure. Market failure was particularly perceived in the area of allocation of resources over time, that is, in investment, because of the myopic character of the participants. At the same time, the literature also emphasized the advantages that come out of coordinated set of projects and investments. And that led to nationwide economic planning, not only in India, but elsewhere in the world. But 40 to 50 years of development experience tells us that can be government failure as well. Not because of faulty investment decisions, which can occur under the private as well as the public sector, but because of the multitudes of controls that we imposed, which resulted in large number of resources, quite a bit of resources being directed towards what used to be called the rent-seeking activities. Can we fault our policymakers for the road that they took in the 1950s and 60s? Partly the answer is no. At that time, there was no clear model available in the world as to what route developing countries, or in those days they were called underdeveloped countries, could take in order to be able to accelerate growth or speed up growth. The only example available at that particular time was the Soviet Union, which over a period of 3 to 4 decades was able to lift the country to a much, much higher level in terms of productivity and in terms of quality of life. And therefore, many people, including Nehru, was attracted to the model that was then available, and we did, not only India, but also many other countries followed. But by the end of 1960s and early 1970s, it was clear that this model was not working, or this model has some problems with it. But I think our policymakers refused to be cognizant of that, and we continued until 1991, when only a big crisis forced us to change track. If you look at the per capita income of India and China, and plot it, you will see, until about 1970, the two countries were almost along the same line. It is only after 1970, China, which moved away from the traditional planning model, started picking up in terms of growth, and it started widening. Therefore, the whole issue is really what is the essence of the new reforms that were introduced. There is a common thread running through the various measures introduced since July 1991. And that is to improve the productivity and efficiency of the system by injecting a greater element of competition. And this is sought to be achieved by removing the barriers to entry and growth. While changes in industrial policy, such as the dismantling of controls, was aimed at improving the domestic competitiveness of Indian industries, changes in foreign trade policy, which meant reducing the tariff levels, meant increasing the international competitiveness of Indian firms. The new economic policy does provide a larger space for the private sector to operate. Some of the areas which were reserved for purely the public sector have now been thrown open, like steel, power, aviation, and so on. As I mentioned earlier, in the 50s and 60s, the view was that the state must occupy the important sectors of the economy, and that is what used to be called the theory of commanding heights. Namely, as in the warfare, you can fight the war only if you capture the commanding heights, and that is what was felt. It is this which led to the proliferation of the state into many, many areas. And this is what sought to be reduced. Now let me once again say, in an economy, the state can play three roles: as a provider of marketable goods and services, as a regulator, and as a provider of public goods and services. What the new economic policy did was to reduce the role of the state as a provider of marketable goods and services. If the market can take care, and if competitiveness can be maintained in the markets, let them do it. But simultaneously, the role of the state as a regulator, the role of the state as a provider of public goods and services are like elementary education, primary health, and you know the definition for public goods, which have externalities, and all those must come under the purview of the public sector. Even there are various models that are available in terms of the provision of public goods. That can be a pure public provision of the services. That can be public-private participation in the provision of services, and so on and so forth. Therefore, there is nothing in the new economic policy which completely takes away the role of the state. In some areas it expands, in some areas it contracts. As somebody said, more market does not mean less government, but different government. And that is really the basis of the new economic policy. Let me come back again to say where the breaks happened. But I would also like to take you to 1991, the background against which the reforms were introduced. 1990 was a bad year for India. Dark clouds were gathering all around. The possibility of default was imminent. The balance of payments deficit, the current account deficit, which had already high even in the previous year, 1988-89, shot up in 1990 because of the Iraq-Kuwait war. the Iraq-Kuwait war led to the tripling of the oil prices in a short period of time. And since we are a major importer of oil, it completely wrecked our balance of payments situation, and the crisis and the current account deficit started rising. It was almost at 3% of the GDP in 1990. Now, the problem was twofold. It was not only that the current account was rising in 1990, but also it became difficult to finance that current account deficit. In 88, 89, it was almost 2.7% of GDP, and we managed. But in 1990, we could not because of several factors. India's credit rating was lower, and that meant some of the traditional sources of financing were also went away. For example, non-resident deposits, which are a source of great strength, instead of coming in, started going out, and that put pressure. But also, I must say, the Iran-Iraq crisis complicated the problems, not only because of the rise in the crude oil prices, but also because of several other factors. We had to take care of the people who wanted to come back to India. I think there was a considerable bill for paying those people. Then, remittances from Middle East reduced. Our export markets in the Middle East also dwindled. All of this created a complication in which our balance of payments crisis was very critical, and we were finding ourselves very difficult to finance it. Much of our oil import at that particular time was financed by short-term credit known as acceptance facility. And the problem was that we could not roll over the short-term credit. This was middle of 1990. I think the VP Singh government was in power at that particular time. In August 1990, we did write to the government saying that the situation is getting critical. We need extraordinary resources, and therefore we must approach the multilateral institutions. But the government didn't take any action. And in the meanwhile, the political situation itself was getting muddier and muddier, and which was getting reflected in the credit rating of India. By December 1990, the VP Singh government had fallen, and the Chandrasekhar government had come to power. When the Chandrasekhar government came to power, when I met him and said that we need to go and get that money, his question was, what he simply said was, what option have you left me? And there was no way, no alternative. So myself and Deepak Nayar went to Washington to negotiate. I will not go into all the details, but we did negotiate. And as we were negotiating for several kinds of facilities, the simplest of that was what is called the compensatory financing facility, which the IMF provides to countries which have been affected because of the sharp increase in the import prices. And the crude oil price increase was such one. And therefore, the IMF was very cooperative on that. I mean, I think they were willing to do it. And we first started doing that. And we were into February of 1991 when the budget could not be presented because of the political situation. And a little later, the Chandrasekhar government also fell. The day Chandrasekhar government fell, I was in Washington. And we were negotiating. And the next morning when we went to fund, they had a strange look. With what government are we negotiating? I myself and my colleagues said, you don't worry about that. Let us settle down on the details. We will take it to whichever government is there, and then we will try to convince that government and get it done. So I said we should not stop the negotiations, we should continue the negotiations and so on. So that is what happened at that particular time. But let me say that at that particular time, India's foreign exchange reserves was equal only to 3 weeks of India's imports. That is the bottom to which we had gone. There was nothing else. And we could not really actually pay for many things. I remember the managing director of Air India walking into my room and said, if there is any mishap happens to Air India, you are responsible. I said, why? You are not releasing money even for spare parts. How do I run the airline industry? So that was so critical, the situation that came. I will cut short the story because I think there is many things to be said, but I only want you to understand the gravity of the situation that prevailed at that particular time, and that, in a very important sense, influenced our decision making at that time. Because I will come back a little later. Let me also tell you at that time, when we were asking not only the multilateral institutions, but also other private banks and others to give us credit, one question they kept on saying is, you have so much stock of gold in your country, why don't you use that? And that will show that you are really serious about tackling your problem. Now, this conversation was going on simultaneously. And we did think that it was appropriate to do something on that score, and that is why we decided that we should pledge some part of the gold that we had. But it is more easily said than done, because we had to abide by the RBI Act. The RBI Act has a number of limitations on it. First of all, we could not pledge the gold which is in the issue department. We could pledge the gold which is only outside the issue department. Therefore, what we did was we transferred some gold from the issue department to the banking department. It was kept there. The other is that the Reserve Bank of India cannot borrow from anybody other than a central bank. So we had to find out which central bank will give us credit. And thirdly, the Reserve Bank of India can borrow only for a short period. It cannot borrow for a long period. Short period being defined as 90 days. So we started working on it. We did so many things. And finally, I must say to the credit of the Chandrasekhar government that they were willing to do it. But they themselves were a sort of unstable government at that time. And while they were willing to go along with us, the actual shipment of gold happened only after the new Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh government came. We were ready for all of those things, but the actual shipment happened only in July 1991, after Manmohan Singh became finance minister and Narasimha Rao became the prime minister. They didn't object anything. They just kept aloof, because you have done everything and you do what you want to do. So they didn't object, but they did not take the initiative to do it. But I can also tell you that the shipment of gold was not such an easy thing. The gold that Reserve Bank of India had all sorts of things as gold. Queen Victoria coins, some from the 17th century, some from earlier period. And they were not what they used to call London good delivery. That is, when you pledge the gold, you have to give them in blocks of gold, which is on which is stamped London good delivery. So we negotiated with Bank of England and Bank of Japan, and we shipped 44 tons of gold to get what may look like today a partially small amount, which was less than $500 million. Therefore, we did it, but I can tell you it was a very traumatic experience to do it. First, we were sending small quantities in the commercial airlines, but the commercial airlines came back and told us, no, we won't take any more. People have some idea, and we are risking our passengers, we won't do it. Then we chartered a flight and put the gold in the chartered flight. And the chartered flight was sitting in Bombay, and some nosy journalist got wind of it. And even as the plane was leaving, it was splashed on the newspapers. We had no intention of hiding it because it cannot be hidden. Once it goes, we will announce, because I think it will be shown in the balance sheet, it will be shown. But all that I was interested at that time was that it should reach London and then release the news. But then the nosy journalist, who became later on a good friend of mine, also splashed the news. And in a sense, it is that brought home to the people of this country what a critical situation in which we are. Like a family, we were pledging the gold to get money. So that is the kind of thing that happened. So, in July 1, 1991, the new government was already there, and we had to take some decision on how to correct the balance of payments, and we took the decision to devalue the rupee. Now, the decision to devalue the rupee was logical, it was the right thing to do, but as you know, it is always a political decision. And the Narasimha Rao government at that time was a minority government. And whether a minority government can take this decision or not was a big question. But two things happened. We decided to do it in two steps. We didn't devalue the whole currency in one whole hog. We did it in two steps. Some people ask, why did you do it in two steps? Well, we thought we'll test the waters and do it. And the second and the most important thing, unlike the previous devaluations, it was not announced by the government. We in the Reserve Bank did it. And in the Reserve Bank, in those days, we used to determine the exchange rate of the rupee every morning. Every morning at 9 o'clock, it was my duty to fix the exchange rate of the rupee. So, as part of the normal routine, we made this change. And then it shocked the market. And we are told now that Mr. Narasimha Rao developed cold feet. And he wanted to stop the second step. So what do? I absconded. So they said, we are not able to reach him. And on the 3rd of July, at 9:30, the finance minister called. And I said, I have jumped. So it was done. On 3rd July, 9 o'clock, the second step was there. We used to call it, code word was hop, skip and jump. So the first thing, then rest, and then the second one. It was done. And I, in retrospect, always felt that the decision that we should do it rather than the government do it was the right one. Otherwise, we would have been probably stopped on the second day. So this much is the background. And I think on the genesis of reforms, 2 or 3 questions are asked. It's part of history, but anyway, one is, what is the role of Narasimha Rao? Because Narasimha Rao was always inscrutable. So what role did Narasimha Rao play? The second is, reforms of some sort have been done in 1980s. Is this a continuation of what was being done in 1980s? And the third question people ask is, all those people who were involved in making these reforms were also part of the old control regime. What made them change their views? Or who is responsible? Or is it dictated by IMF? I think that's the key question. Now let me briefly answer, because these questions are bandied about all the time. Narasimha Rao was not a reluctant reformer. I have written a piece entitled Narasimha Rao, Not a Reluctant Reformer. It is true that Dr. Manmohan Singh was a torchbearer. He was the one who articulated the rationale behind reforms. Not only the rationale, but also the details of the reforms were all set by him. But without a political support, because at that time Dr. Manmohan Singh was a bureaucrat who was just entered. Without a political support, it could not have been done, and Narasimha Rao was well behind it. In fact, two things I would like to cite because it is overlooked. The dismantling of the controls in the industrial India area was done by him because as Prime Minister, he held the portfolio of industry. So it was he who did it. But he always couched the explanations in a language which could assuage the old gods in Congress. So he always said it is a continuation. It is Nehruvian socialism modified. So all that he was saying. And he also used the word middle path. So all these, but the style in which Narasimha Rao put it, because he had to carry the party with him, and therefore he did that. But I would say that very clearly, there are other examples I can give, but I can very clearly say that he provided the political support which was needed. Is it a break or continuation? I would say that I was also involved with the various committees in 1980s, which opened up a little bit. The Alexandra Committee on Exports and Imports, and then there was the other committee on shifting from physical controls to financial controls, and so on. But they were all in the context of a control regime. It's not a break from the control regime. And on what was responsible for changing the mind? I think that I have myself asked. I have asked the question to myself, and I have asked the question to Dr. Manmohan Singh as well. And the only answer that I can find is the enormity of the crisis that really made the change. I mean, I think that there is no other explanation. I mean, we have been all thinking about it, but it is the severity of the crisis that really made us change. Now, I think very briefly, let me say that the reforms as they were initiated at that time covered a wide area. Started with fiscal policy, cutting the fiscal deficit. But please remember, there was also another policy, which was integrating with the rest of the world. And that meant you have to cut the import tariffs. Therefore, we had to do the balancing act of cutting the import tariffs and at the same time maintaining a low current account deficit. That was a big problem. The big changes happened in the external sector. That, first of all, the entire policy towards foreign investment changed. The foreign investment earlier on, even though allowed into the country, was under the condition that the foreigner cannot have a majority control in India. No foreigner wanted to come under that condition. So this was relaxed, and that is why we talk about the foreign direct investment. Now, we had to proceed on a step-by-step basis because we couldn't open it up immediately, but that we did that. And earlier on, nobody could invest in the Indian stock market. And for the first time, the foreign institutional investors, a new term that was coined and identified by SEBI and the RBI, to allow them to invest. And look at the banking system. The banking system underwent a big change. It underwent a change in many respects. For the first time, we introduced the prudential norms. The capital adequacy ratio was prescribed, and so on. And many of the terms that we are using today, like non-performing assets, did not exist at that time. Because every bank was identifying, according to its own light, what is performing and what is not performing. There was no definition of non-performing. That is what we now call income recognition norms. They didn't exist at that time. So and then we allowed the opening of the new private sector banks. And many of the private sector banks that we talk today, ICICI, HDFC, were all licensed at that particular time. It didn't require actually a statutory change. The Act permitted the setting up of private banking institutions, but it was not acted upon for, I don't know, maybe 3 decades or 4 decades we activate. And another important thing, that as far as the public sector banks are concerned, amending the Nationalization Act to enable the ownership of the state to come down from 100% to 51% was a difficult exercise, because there is an emotional attachment as far as the Congress party was concerned with respect to the nationalization of commercial banks. To make them agree to reduce the stake of the government in that was a very difficult thing, but we went on arguing with them that we are not doing away with the public character of the public sector banks, because 51% means the majority ownership is with the banks and so on. And I can go on with all the other areas. Now, very quickly, I want to only say that if you look at the record of the performance of the Indian economy, you will very clearly see that the growth rate of the Indian economy has picked up much stronger in the post-liberalization period. You can look at any set of numbers. I will not go into it. I already taken a long time. So I will say that very clearly the rate of growth of the Indian economy since 92-93 has been something like 6.8%. In the first 3 decades, 1950 to 1980, the rate of growth of the Indian economy was 3.5%. And at that time, population was growing at almost 2.2%, and the per capita income growth was only 1.3%. Since 2005, I think the economy had even picked up much more. Between 2005-6 and 2007-8, the average annual rate of the growth of the economy was 9.4%. In 2008-9, because of the international crisis, it came down to 6.7%. But the reversal was very quick. In the next 2 years, the average rate of growth was 8.6% and 8.9%. Then came the decline. Quite clearly, reforms have contributed to a faster rate of growth, but we are seeing a decline in the growth rate in the last few years. And that is a question that needs to be addressed, and if I have the time, I will come to that later. But one question that people will keep on asking you, as far as the reforms is concerned, is that, is growth the only indicator by which you measure the performance of the economy? What about the distribution of income? What about the standard of living of the people? So that is why Amartya Sen calls his book An Uncertain Glory. What is uncertain about it, and what is the glory that we are talking about? The glory I mentioned, namely that the rate of growth of the economy picked up tremendously in the post-liberalization period. But India is ranked, something like 130 out of 188 countries in terms of the HRD index. And that clearly indicates that we do not, in terms of social development, really do not rank high. And is that not a concern? Now, there are several ways of answering this problem. What we need to understand is a relationship between growth, let us say, and social development, let us call the social indicators. What is the link between the two? Can growth happen without social development? And you can also put the reverse question. Can social development be sustained without growth? There is some synergic effect between the two, which we need to take care of. In fact, for example, if you have social development and you have more schools and more graduates coming out, and if the economy is not growing and is not able to absorb the people who come out, you have created even greater tension in the system. Therefore, social development of the type that we want cannot be sustained unless there is a growth. Growth does help social development in an important way. As they say, the rising tide lifts all boats. Therefore, if growth happens, and that growth happens in a strong way, if you are growing at 3.5%, the trickle down will not happen. That's not much. The one country in the world, which we can cite the example, which eradicated poverty by simply going strong is South Korea. South Korea, once again, South Korea's per capita income and our per capita income in 1951-52 is exactly the same. But by growing at 7% plus for over for 4 decades, they eliminated poverty. Growth will help, for raising the resources for social development areas, and growth will also help by trickle down to the extent possible. But the point, and I also would like to say, some indicators you can look at. Look at the poverty ratio. If you look at the poverty ratio, between 1993, 94 and 2004-5, the per capita income grew at 4.3%. And the annual rate of reduction in the poverty ratio was less than 1%, 0.7. Look at the next period, 2004-5 to 11-12. The per capita income grew at 6.7%. The annual rate of reduction in the poverty ratio is 2.2%. So there is enough evidence to show that growth does help. But the question can still be asked, does growth help enough or adequate to do it? Even our own committee estimated that the total number of people below the poverty line is close to 30%. It's a very large number that we need to do it. But then growth does play a very important part in this. You can look at the NSS consumption expenditure of the 2 or 3 periods. I find I have written elsewhere that in every decile of the population, there is a growth, stronger growth. And in terms of the ratio of growth between any 2 periods, it is stronger for the bottom 5 deciles rather than the top 5 deciles. But having said all of that, I'm not the one to say that we have done well on that score. There are many, many indicators on which we can see that the economy needs to do much, much better. But growth is certainly an important factor. Now let me briefly come to 2 things and conclude there. One is, what are the areas we should look at in terms of reforms, having done all of this? The basic objective that we have in mind is really to improve the productivity and the efficiency of the system, give better competition. Anything that goes to improve the efficiency of the system is a primary criteria. For example, GST is important. I think it will not do as some optimists very much think about GST. In the initial years, you will have more problems than really solving the problems, because introducing GST is not that easy. But it will result in, over a period of time, in a form of taxation or a tax structure which will help to allocate resources optimally, and therefore GST is important. And you must also heard a lot about the Land Acquisition Act and land acquisition procedures and so on. In my view, acquisition is antithesis of competition. Acquisition means what? Compulsorily acquire. That is an opposite of competition. And therefore, I do not favor a land act which really gives a lot of powers for acquisition. Except for public policy of a particular nature, I think we should leave it to the market to decide. And one argument earlier used to be that the farmers do not know the market well and all that. I think that argument no longer holds good. I think they know the market very well, and the land market will operate, and therefore it will be. And third, we think that we have knocked off all controls. That is also not true. There are still industries in our country which have controls reminiscent of the pre-1991 type. The classic example is the sugar industry. In the case of the sugar industry, the sugarcane growers get what is called the fair and remunerative price. And then the state governments, on top of it, fix another price which is called the state-aided price. For locating a sugar mill, there is a distance criterion. You cannot do it within a certain distance. And when And then the sugar mills have to obtain a monthly release in terms of allocation. So there are many things that are there. And also, molasses, which is a byproduct of this, is also being controlled. And many state governments do not allow the molasses to be what they call exported to other states. It should all be consumed inside that state. Why? They have an interest because then the molasses prices will be kept low, and then the liquor industry can benefit and they can get more excise duties. This is a classic case of subsidizing liquor industry. So there are industries, there are segments where the pre-1991 type of controls exist. Another is a fertilizer industry. We need to dismantle all of them. There is a problem about pricing of natural resources. That is not a market. That is not always a market. This came up in a big way on gas pricing, natural gas pricing. And if market cannot fix the price, I think we need a very transparent method by which the prices are fixed. Very often we hear the argument that agriculture has not been touched by reforms. That is because reforms in agriculture earlier was interpreted in a totally different way. Land sealing, these were the types of land reforms. Whenever people talk of land reforms, that is the direction in which we are moving. Certainly, I believe agricultural marketing is archaic in our country. And we need to modify it. And when some years ago, when vegetable prices went up very high, it is very clearly shown that the wholesale market in vegetables operates in such a way that the prices go up. So we really need, that is the Agriculture Prices and Marketing Act, which was originally intended to help the farmers. But the way in which it is functioning, it is really the opposite. Because under that thing, farmer cannot sell his product except through mandi. Now, if you are a big hotel, let's say, and you want to go and buy vegetables directly from the farmer, you cannot do it. We had recommended that in the case of perishable products, it should be exempt from the act. I think several states have done it. I do not know whether Gujarat has done it or not. Those are the things that are required. And finally, the area in which we need reforms is in the area of governance. I think governance reforms are most essential because the state still continues to play an important part. And that is, in some sense, a low-hanging fruit. And it can be plucked. And that's what they should do. Now, before I conclude, let me make only two short comments. One is, people look at the current status of the Indian economy and have many doubts and raise questions as to what can be done. I mentioned about the slowing of the growth. Why did the growth slow down? And that is simply because of, as I see it, two factors. Many of you may be familiar with the famous Herod-Omar growth model equation. G is equal to S over V. G is the growth rate. S is the savings rate, or in equilibrium, it is the investment rate, divided by V, which is the incremental capital output ratio, ICOR as we call it. That is the investment rate of the economy, divided by how much of capital do you require to produce 1 unit of output. Say, for example, if an economy saves 20% and invests 20%, and with the incremental capital output ratio is 4:1, the growth rate is 5. So these are the two. I mean, there are many complications here in terms of lags, and then the incremental capital output ratio is a term. It has many other implications which needs to be spelled out. But what has really happened is that over the years, in 2007-8 was the best performance India had. That is 9.4 or 9.5%. In that year, the investment rate of the economy was 38%. And the incremental capital output ratio is 4:1. And that is why you got a growth rate of 9.5%. I'm simplifying. I know there are complications. But that is the thing that happened. What has happened since then? Two things have happened. One, the investment rate has fallen. It was not falling very much up to 12, 13 or 13, 14. Since then, it has fallen very sharply. And I was surprised to find that in the latest one, for 2016-17, it is 26.9. It's a very sharp fall from where we were. Therefore, as the investment rate falls, I think the growth rate suffers. The other is simultaneously, which we are talking in the afternoon, the rise in the incremental capital output ratio. The rise in the incremental capital output ratio, or let me put it, the incremental capital output ratio is the inverse of the efficiency of capital. The higher the ICOR, the lower the efficiency in the use of capital. Why does the ICOR rise? Because in 2013-14, if you look at our investment rate and divided it by 4, you would have gotten a much higher rate of growth. We didn't get it, but we got only less than 5%. Why? Because of the several factors. One that we really talk about is the delay in the completion of projects. The term that is used nowadays is stalled projects. And the extraordinary increase in the stalled projects has been a complicating factor. But you can ask the question, why does the delay occur in the completion of projects? It can occur because of two sets of reasons. One, endogenous, in the sense, in terms of the firm itself. And because of inefficiency in the management or whatever. There are also factors outside which could be responsible. One is really land acquisition was stalled, or environmental clearance did not come after the project was started. So all that leads to the delay in the completion of projects. It can also happen because of what happened, because of complementary investments not happening in related sectors. The power sector might have expanded, but if the coal sector has not expanded, then adequate coal doesn't come in. And more importantly, is the extension of the railway services to carry the coal from the pit to the factory. All these things had happened at that particular time. And then, of course, lack of critical imports. At one time, the power sector suffered because of the lack of coal. That is not true today. I think the coal sector is doing well. But I do know of many projects in Andhra Pradesh and even Tamil Nadu, where power projects set up with the use of gas are all lying idle, because gas availability has come down. They are all built up on the assumption of a very high growth rate in natural gas. That did not happen. So many factors contribute to this, and that is and at one time, whether I have the numbers or not here, yes, the total value of the stalled projects was estimated at 8.8 lakh crore, and therefore individual action was required to look at each one of the projects to do it. But then, we have not answered the first question, why did the investment rate fall? And that is a result of so many factors. If you have been reading the newspapers in 2011, 12, 13, and 13, 14, the one word or the one phrase that used to recur everywhere in the newspaper was policy paralysis. Namely that we have not been able to push forward because the government is not able to take decisions, and that is what is leading to the situation. It is true in some sense that at that particular time, because of the many levels of complaints on graft and so on, the energies of the government were spent on tackling those issues. But that by itself does not explain. And now, again, the question is, why is the investment rate still falling? Well, investment rate falling is also because of the fall in the growth rate. Students of economics would know about the acceleration theory. The acceleration theory clearly says investment in the teeth period is a function of the output of the previous period and the period previous to it. That is, it is only when output is increasing, demand is increasing, and therefore investment is happening. Once the cycle turns down, then it has a cumulative effect. So that is happening. But also, There are issues relating to sentiment. I do believe non-economic factors play as important a role in creating the investment sentiment as the economic factors, and policymakers need to understand that. Let me conclude. If only India grows at the rate of 8 to 9%, India's per capita GDP will grow from the current level of $1,800 to $8,000 by 2030. Then only India will be classified as a true middle-income country. Therefore, we have a long way to go in terms of the growth that we need to achieve. As I mentioned earlier, it is in a period of high growth. We are also able to introduce many of the social development projects, such as the extended food security, rural employment guarantee scheme, and so on and so forth. Therefore, the focus of policy has to be twofold. That's a conclusion to which I want to draw your attention. Development has many dimensions. It has to be inclusive, it must be poverty reducing, and it must be environment friendly. All these factors need to be built into the growth process. But at the same time, I would say, growth by itself is important. And that is the only one that will enable you to be able to really take care of the other factors. Strong economic growth is the answer to many of our socio-economic problems. Reforms must carry acceptance. Reforms are not ends in themselves. Not even growth is an end in itself. It is only the growth triggered by reform, which spreads all over, that is really critically important. So we need a twofold strategy in terms of the growth process. One, accelerating growth, and at the same time, second, addressing directly the problems faced by the vulnerable groups. Growth and equity, in my opinion, should not be posed as opposing considerations. They must be weaved together to produce an acceptable process of development. Therein lies, if I may use the term, economic statesmanship. Thank you.